Good morning, folks. Welcome back to my living room as we spend some time in God's Word today. Just wondering, how much influence do you think you have? How much influence? And another question would be, who do you think that you would influence? I'm going to read you a little excerpt I have here of someone, and it was about years ago in the communist government in China. They commissioned an author to write a biography of Hudson Taylor with the purpose of distorting the facts and presenting him in a bad light. They wanted to discredit the name of this consecrated missionary of the gospel. As the author was doing his research, he was increasingly impressed by Taylor's saintly character and his godly life, and he found it extremely difficult to carry out his assigned task with a clear conscience. Eventually, at the risk of losing his life, he laid aside his pen, renounced his atheism, and received Jesus Christ as his personal Savior. Isn't that amazing? The influence of a man who had long been dead still had some influence. There was a mother took her young son shopping, and after a full day of shopping and going from store to store to store, they got to one store, and the clerk had a lollipop and reached over with the lollipop and handed it to the young boy. And the mother turned to her little boy and she says, "Now what do you say?" And the little boy said, "Charge it." She had left an influence on her son. You know, today I want to take a brief overview. We've been looking at the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah, and I want to take a brief overview look at these kings, and I want us to observe or to take a look at three observations for us to consider. All right, and with this question in light as we look at these three specific observations, and that is, what kind of influence am I? What kind of influence am I? Steve Taylor, what kind of an influence am I? What kind of influence are you to the people that are around you? Now, we know that when the kingdom split, when Saul was the first king of Israel, and then David, and then David's son Solomon took over, and Solomon's son Rehoboam took over, and the kingdom split there with Rehoboam, and we have Rehoboam and we have Jeroboam, and Jeroboam was promised some great things from God, from the prophet Ahijah, who came and met with him and told him what was happening. And he said, you know, you live for God and you do things right, God will bless you. And he promised Jeroboam that. And we know that as Jeroboam took the kingdom, he doubted that God, although God gave him the kingdom in 10 of the 12 tribes, we know that his faith was like zero, and he immediately erected a couple of golden calves, one in Bethel and one in Dan, and told the people, you know, you don't need to go to Jerusalem to worship. You can stay here and worship, and here's your new God, okay? Here's these golden calves, all right? And what he had done, and the Bible refers to this over and over and over again as what Jeroboam did, and he caused Israel to sin, all right? And he drug Israel down from a nation that honored God to a nation that was worshiping idols. And we know that there's 19 kings in the northern kingdom before they were all taken off to Babylon and so forth. And all 19 of these kings were bad kings. But I want us to take a look at something that's really rather unique here. Jeroboam, his son, after him, his name was Nadab. And Nadab was a wicked, evil king, just like his father Jeroboam was. And we see in 1 Kings chapter 15, I'm going to read several verses here. You can follow along if you'd like. We're going to see a pattern that develops here. All right, and in 1 Kings chapter 15 and verse 26, and speaking of Nadab, Jeroboam's son, second king of the divided kingdom of Israel, he says, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord, and walked in the way of his father, and in his sin wherewith he made Israel to sin. Again, speaking of Jeroboam, he made Israel to sin by what he was doing here, and we see that Nadab and his son followed right in his footsteps. All right. Now there was another king that came up after Nadab, and his name was Baasha, and he wasn't related to Jeroboam, but he came into the scene there, and we see that after he became king, he killed all of Jeroboam's seed, so his seed couldn't go any further. Just God had promised him that his seed would keep going if he followed him, and he did not. And Baasha went in there and he wiped out everybody that had anything to do with Jeroboam. But here's Baasha's epitaph, as you might say here. And in 1 Kings, again, still in chapter 15, but now down in verse 34, and it says, "And he did evil in the sight of the Lord, and walked in the way of Jeroboam, and in his sin wherewith he made Israel to sin." Doesn't that sound like the same verse almost that we just read about Nadab? And this was about Baasha, all right? And Baasha, like I said, he went in and he wiped out the rest of Jeroboam's seed, but he didn't turn from the sin, all right? That kingdom, Nadab's kingdom, was crushed because he didn't follow God, and yet Baasha went in there and wiped out his seed and followed in the same pattern that Jeroboam had already set down a number of years before. And we see that as Baasha dies, his son, his name is Elah, and he comes to be the king, and he reigned there for only for 2 years. And there's only just a few verses about Elah, okay? And he's kind of unique with amongst all the rest of the kings, and I'll get to that as we go along here. But there's only just a few verses of Elah, even though he reigned for 2 years. But it talks in those few verses that's there, it speaks of how evil that Elah was, and how he was like his father Baasha, who followed Jeroboam. All right, and his captain, he had a captain of half of his chariots. So he had a captain. His name was Zimri. He killed he killed Elah, and then he proceeded to wipe out all of Baasha's seed and so forth. And he reigned in his stead. But his name was Zimri, and Zimri, although he only reigned for 7 days, it does tell us some things about him, and that he wiped out all of Baasha's seed along with Elah. All right, and he killed Elah, but. And after his 7 days of reign, he actually killed himself. He lit his palace on fire, and he burned to the ground inside that palace. But even in those 7 days, and all of the time of what he was doing, in 1 Kings chapter 16 and verse 19, it tells us what kind of a man Zimri was. Take a look there, if you will. 1 Kings 16, verse 19, it says, "For his sins which he sinned in doing evil in the sight of the Lord, in walking in the way of," guess who? Jeroboam, "and in his sin which he did to make Israel to sin." He followed right along with Jeroboam. Let's worship these golden calves. Yeah, all right? And that's what he did. Now, after Zimri died, we have Omri. And we've looked at Omri before, and we see that there's a verse in there that talks about Omri, that he did worse than all of the kings before him. And we know that Omri was Ahab's father, and he was an evil, vile king as well. All right? But here's his epitaph. Are you ready for this? In 1 Kings chapter 16, but now down in verse 26, it says, "For he walked in all the way of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, and in his sin wherewith he made Israel to sin, to provoke the Lord God of Israel to anger with their vanities." Omri did the same thing. He followed in the sins of Jeroboam. And Omri's evil son was Ahab, and he was even more wicked than his father was. All right? And if we zip down there, we're in 16 verse 26, just slide right on down to 16 and verse 31, speaking of Ahab, and it says, "And it came to pass, as if it had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, that he took to wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Zidonians, and went and served Baal and worshipped him." So he did the same thing, walked in the sins of Jeroboam, and then he added to that Baal worship. And that's with Jezebel, when she came over, she brought Baal worship into the northern kingdom of Israel. Jeroboam passed his sin off to his son Nadab. Now Baasha, like I said, wiped out all of that family, but you know what? They followed in his sin. And Elah, his son, followed his father. Zimri wiped out all of Baasha's family, but the sin perpetuated to other families, and the fathers continued to pass the sin on to their children. We see that 18 out of 19 of these children, of kings rather, 18 out of the 19 of the kings, we have the same epitaph, all right? The only one that it doesn't have it is because it's Elah. They only talk about him for just a few verses there, and it says that he followed in the evil ways of his father, who was following in the sins of Jeroboam anyway. So if there was another verse in there, it probably would have said that he followed in the ways of Jeroboam. You know, if my mother always used to tell me, she says, you know, whatever I did, if I came over to help her with some plumbing, you know, she'd always ask, would you like to be a plumber and have done that, you know, for a living? No, Mom. I was quite happy being a firefighter, you know. And if I was building something for her, would you like to be a carpenter? She'd always tell me, you know, always wanted to give me a new profession and see how I would like that. But you know what? If I was a professional gravestone engraver, all right, I would go to these kings, if I could live through all 19 of these reigns, and say, listen, I'm going to be engraving your gravestone, your tombstone, and I want to put your epitaph on it. You have two choices of epitaphs. What would they be? It would be, you followed in the way of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin, or in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin. Which would you like me to put on your tombstone? Because they were all the same. All right, after Ahab, we had Ahaziah, and it says in chapter 22 and verse 52, it says, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord and walked in the way of his father and in the way of his mother, that wicked Jezebel, and in the way of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin. All right, and then if we want to go look at Jehoram in 2 Kings 3:3, same thing. Jehu in 2 Kings 10:29, same thing. Jehoahaz, 2 Kings 13 and verse 2, same thing. Jehoash, the next king, 2 Kings 13:11, the same thing. The next king was Jeroboam the second. Any guesses as to what it said on his tombstone? Same thing, all right? And so what am I saying? I could go on, and I'm not going to bore you with all these verses. Look them up, check them out. Are they all, you can find it in each one of their lives. They followed in the sons of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin. So what am I saying? What am I saying? The propensity, it's a fancy word for inclination or the tendency to do something, but the propensity to sin is passed on by our influence. The propensity of sin is passed on by our influence. I read a little statistic, and it says that children who see physical violence between their parents are 6 times more likely to abuse their own spouses after they marry. Now, am I saying that we're all doomed to fall into the sins of our fathers, our parents, and those others that we allow to influence us? Possibly, no. What I'm saying is that we need to break the chain, okay? Those that come behind us will not have that same propensity if we can break that chain, okay? If there's a way, okay, if they can go there, it's everything we do is a choice, all right? But we can make the choices easier, or we can make the choices harder by our influence, okay? I'll give you an example. My dad, when he was young, this is a crazy thing to show you how great our scientists are, okay? But when my dad was young, he had a problem with nosebleeds. So he went to the doctor to find out what he can do about these constant nosebleeds. And the doctor prescribed for him, are you ready for this? The doctor said to him, what you need to do to stop your nose from bleeding is you need to smoke cigarettes. Oh, that's what the doctor prescribed. That shows how much we can rely on scientists, okay? At that time, we're talking in the 1940s, 50s, probably in the 1940s, okay? And the doctor prescribed cigarettes, and my dad would light a cigarette in the morning, and he would light each cigarette after that off of the one that he'd lit before. He smoked constantly, all right? Now, this was before he got saved. He went in the army and so forth. I'm not going to tell you all that story, but when he got out and he got saved, got out of the army, and he got saved, he went to church, and he came out of church after church, and the first thing he did was he lit up a cigarette. And he looked around, And this is his words, okay? And he said to me, he says, I looked around and I was the only idiot smoking there. He says, well, I guess Christians shouldn't be doing this. He figured, and he went home and he crunched up his box of cigarettes. He threw them in the toilet. He flushed them down the toilet, and he never smoked another one. The influence that a parent has on their child, like I never saw my dad smoke. This was long before I was born, and that was never a temptation for me. Okay, it was just, it wasn't there. But if what I'm saying here is this, is that when we sin, okay, the people that are around us are influenced by that. And the propensity is there, the inclination is there, the pattern is set, and it's easier for them to follow that. And it could be harder for them, that the temptation for that can be harder for them if we don't break that chain. That sin is still a personal choice. Don't get me wrong here. We can't blame it on, well, I do this because my father did this, okay? Or I do this because my mother did this, or my mentor did this, or something like that. Sin is still a choice, but our influence, get this, our influence can make some choices harder than others. In some battles, harder than others, than they need to be, okay? So, can our influence only have a negative effect? Quite the contrary. Quite the contrary. And I believe the exact opposite is true. You remember Solomon? We go from King Saul to King David, and then David had all the wars and everything, and he couldn't build the temple because blood was on his hands, because he was a man of war. Solomon didn't have that. Okay, Solomon comes and he has a reign of peace, and God granted Solomon wisdom, it says, above everybody else that ever would live. Okay, people would come from miles to hear of his wisdom, and that they got great amount of funds into the money that would come in. These kings would come to listen, to Solomon's wisdom, and they would pay money to do this, and he would expound on nature and other things that it was just amazing what God had given to him. All right, and Solomon's heart got turned away because Solomon started to marry several wives. That's an understatement, okay? 700 wives, 300 concubines, 1,000 women that Solomon had. And the Bible says that these women turned his heart away from God. They turned his heart away from God. When God sent Ahijah the prophet to Jeroboam to tell him, you know what? I'm going to rip the kingdom away, and I'm going to give you 10 tribes. And God made a promise to Jeroboam, you just follow me and you trust me and you put your faith in me. And if you do that, I will bless you and I will give you a sure kingdom. But he did say something else, all right? In 1 Kings chapter 11, turn there with me if you will, please. 1 Kings chapter 11, starting in verse 33 and verse 34. He's talking about Israel. As I said, Solomon had brought all these women in there, and these women turned his heart away from God, and they started worshiping other gods and other idols. We know they're all false gods with little g, all right? But we see here in verse 33 of 1 Kings 11, it says, because that they have forsaken me, speaking of all Israel, okay, it's the United Kingdom at this point, and have worshipped Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Zidonians, Chemosh, the god of the Moabites, Milcom, the god of the children of Ammon, and have not walked in my ways to do that which is right in mine eyes, and to keep my statutes and my judgments, as did David his father. He didn't follow me. He's not doing what's right, but his father did. Verse 34, howbeit, I will not take the whole kingdom out of his hand, but I will make him prince all the days of his life. Why? For David, my servant's sake, whom I chose, because he kept my commandments and my statutes. Solomon, although he brought in all of these other gods, had led Israel away from worshiping God, God wasn't going to drop all of his wrath on him because of David, his father, who followed God. There is definite grace and mercy and blessing that can be passed on to our children and to those who choose to be under our influence. All right, there is an umbrella of protection that is offered to them. Years ago, when I was working, we used to the Brantford Fire Department used to cover all of Brant County as far as car rescues and extrications and so forth. And we had this really bad accident heading out towards Simcoe, which is a long haul down Old Highway 24 from the fire hall. And I was riding on, back then we had a truck that was just designated for that called a rescue truck. Then they went to pumper rescue, so they did two things at once. But back then it was basically a cube van full of all our extrication gear and hydraulics for cutting apart vehicles and so forth. And it was icy day, it was a cold day, and the roads were icy, hence the reason there was a big car accident. And I was sitting in the back, but there was you'd have the driver here and the officer here, and right behind him in two little jump seats, I was right behind the driver facing the other guy who's facing me, right, and we were kind of looking this way, and these two guys are looking that way. And we're coming up on the accident, all right, and the guy who's driving hits the brakes and nothing happens because we are on a sheet of ice. The officer said to him, he says, "Garth, have you got it?" And he says, "No, I don't." And the officer's got his hands on the dash, like clinging, almost put fingerprints in the dashboard. And there was a car here with regular civilians in it, and then there was a space in front of that, and then there was a big transport truck, and then there was the accident that was further up. But beside this car, right beside it, there was an OPP car. So what Garth thought he was going to do is, well, I don't want to hit these people. I'll hit the police car instead. You know, we work together, the police and the fire. You know, I don't want to hit anybody. But so he tried to steer to hit the police car. We're going to hit this guy at 80 kilometers an hour, 70 kilometers an hour. I might have slowed down a little bit. And he turns the wheel to the left to ram into this police car, and it's not steering at all. And then as the truck is coming along like this, trying to steer left, the truck's coming up right on this car. You see these kids are looking out, their eyes are like saucers as they see this truck come barreling at them. The truck goes sliding around them like this, past the car, slid between the car and a tractor trailer like that, and slid up beside the tractor trailer and stopped. It was like God reached his hand down, grabbed the truck and went woo, like that, and stopped it like that. And everybody in the truck went like this. And afterwards, the fella across from me, you know what he said? He said, "Sure, I'm glad that you were with us, or we wouldn't have got out of that." You know what? Whether you believe that's true or not, I do. I believe that God had his hand there, and these guys got protected because God has his hand on me. All right? But it's the same with our influence. All right? If we can have a positive influence as David did, and because of what David had done and his positive influence, Solomon didn't get all the wrath of God and all of the repercussions that should have happened from his sin. He didn't have to suffer any of that. He didn't get to see any of that, or not all of it at least, because of what was passed on from his father. 3 lessons this morning, all right? First of all, the propensity to sin, or the influence of the sin, is passed on, okay, by our influence. Our sin, the propensity, the way that it works, okay, and the probability of it, and the inclination, that's the word I'm trying to come up with here, and the tendency there, or the propensity to sin, is passed on by our influence. Number 2, one person's righteousness can spare others. We can spare others. And number 3, okay, no matter how long and strong your walk has been with God, you are no match for sin. Remember Joash? We looked at him last week. Became a king at 7 years old. Jehoiada was the priest there, okay? And Jehoiada tutored him and counseled him and helped him all the way through his reign. We see there in 2 Chronicles, if you'll go to 2 Chronicles now, please, in chapter 24, we see here, it says in verse number 2, it says, "And Joash did that which was right in the sight of the Lord all the days of Jehoiada the priest." All the days that Jehoiada was the priest, Joash did what was right, okay? But if you skip down to verse number 15, it says, "But Jehoiada waxed old and was full of days when he died. 130 years old was he when he died." And we talked about that last week. "And they buried him in the city of David among the kings, because he had done good in Israel, both toward God and toward his house." And verse number 17 says, "Now after the death of Jehoiada came the princes of Judah and made obeisance to the king. Then the king hearkened unto them." He listened to these princes of Judah that came in there. What did he listen to them for? He listened to them that they didn't want to serve God like they had been. All right, and if we were to read down and look at verse 18, it tells us that they left the house of God and that they went and they served idols. And in verse 19, it tells us that God sent prophets there to warn Joash and say, "Turn around, what you're doing is wrong." And he refused to listen. And in verse 20, God sends Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada, to say, "Look at what you're doing is wrong. You need to turn." And we see here that the ultimate in verse 21, Joash has Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada, who had tutored him all this time and counseled him all this time, saved his life. All right, him and his wife and the nurse that they took them away from Queen Athaliah when she was trying to exterminate everybody so that she could become the queen. All right, and she was the queen for 6 years. But Joash had Zechariah stoned. But I want you to take note of verse number 23. And it says, "And it came to pass at the end of the year that the hosts of Syria come up against him, and they came to Judah and Jerusalem, destroyed all the princes of the people from among the people, sent all the spoil of them unto the king of Damascus." When did it happen? At the end of that year. Verse 25 tells us that he had great diseases, that Joash was left with these great diseases, and they came in, and 2 of his servants came in and killed him. Okay? If we were to back up just ever so quickly to chapter 24 there in verse number 1, it tells us that he reigned for 40 years. If we look here, that at the end of the year after Jehoiada died, that this came, and it came to pass at the end of the year. You know what? Joash followed Jehoiada. He did what was right in the sight of God for 38 or 39 of the 40 years that he reigned. 38, probably 39 years doing what was right, following God. He had the temple rebuilt. And yet it seems that at the end of this 38, 39 years, as soon as Jehoiada dies, he dropped. He dropped it all, and he fell from the Lord. How could he do that after following God for so long and doing what is right for so long? 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Let's zip to the New Testament. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 12 says, "Wherefore let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall." I'm going to tell you something. Sin is powerful. The temptation to sin is great. And it doesn't matter if you've been following God for 38, 39 years. The temptation is great there. Sin does not play fair. It doesn't. Satan does not play fair. Satan lies. Remember what Jesus said in John chapter 8 and verse 44? He says, "Ye are of your father the devil, and the lusts of your father ye will do. He," speaking of Satan, "was a murderer from the beginning and abode not in the truth, because there is no truth in him." In who? In Satan. He, when he, Satan, speaketh a lie, he, Satan, speaketh of his own, For he, Satan, is a liar and the father of it. Okay? Satan's a liar. Sin is a lie. 3 lessons to learn. The propensity or the tendency or inclination to sin is passed on by our influence. We must break the chain to give those behind us a greater chance. Can't harness them with a problem. They say, like, when a drug addict has a baby, when that baby is born, it's already addicted to heroin or whatever that the mother was addicted to. She's passed that on to the child, all right? And when we sin, we do the same thing. We pass that propensity to sin. That tendency is there for our children and those that we influence to follow the same sins that we do, because sin is powerful. It is evil, it is vile, but it is powerful. It's more powerful than you, it's more powerful than me. We must break that chain to give our people under us, behind us, those that we have influence over, a greater chance. They can make a choice and they can choose to go back there, but we need to lessen that temptation. Second lesson to learn. One person's righteousness can spare others. Living in a way that pleases God will offer protection to those who we have influence over, whether it's our children, whether it's the people under us in a particular ministry or something else. One person's righteousness can spare others. We saw that with David. And the third thing, no matter how long and strong your walk has been with God, you are no match for sin. We need to be ever humble before God. You know what David said? In one of the neatest chapters in the whole Bible, in Psalm 139, starting in verse 23 and verse 24, he says, here's David. He says, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts, and see if there be any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way of everlasting." What is David saying here? He's saying, I don't trust how good I think I am. I don't trust how strong that I think I am. You be the judge, God, and you point out my flaws. Show me what my weaknesses are, and then you be my guide as to what is right and to what is holy, because I can't trust my own judgment on this. And we can't trust our own judgment on this. There's Joash, 39 years, doing what's right, had the temple rebuilt, doing all kinds of things. And you know what? The influence was gone of Jehoiada, and he crashed, all right? And sometimes it doesn't, a situation can come up in our life, and it can cause us to doubt and cause us to change, all right? We need to ever be leaning on God. We need to ever be humble before God. We need to say that with David, as he said, "Search me, O God, and know my heart, and try me, and know my thoughts, and see if there be any wicked way in me." Doesn't stop there. "And lead me." You be the one that I can follow. We can always trust God. His influence is always there. His influence is always right. But he says, lead me in the way everlasting. Some very important observations we can get after we've looked at these kings. But I want you to think about these things, all right? Spend some time in Psalm 139 and see as David fellowships with God. But don't miss those last couple of verses there, or verses 23 and verse 24, where he says, God, you be the judge, and you lead me, and you show me what I need. We're weak. Sin is more powerful than we are. It doesn't matter how long we serve God. We can fall. Let him that thinketh he stand take heed, lest he fall, as it says in Corinthians there. Have a great day. Spend some time in God's Word.